Summer 2019. My grandfather's private lake sat quiet behind my house. Then the HOA president announced she was selling it to developers. Neighbors gasped. Nobody bothered to check the deed. I just smiled and calmly asked her to double-check the paperwork. Her hand started shaking before she even opened the folder. 2 board members quietly stepped back from her side of the table. What she didn't know that night would end her reign forever. My name is Emily Carter, 34, a hydrologist who spent every childhood summer fishing this lake with my grandfather, Walter Ashworth. He left me the house, the dock, and 30 private acres of water when he passed 6 years ago, along with a deed clearer and more airtight than anything I'd ever personally reviewed in my professional life. I live alone now in his old lake house inside Cedar Hollow Estates, a quiet North Carolina subdivision built around the shoreline my family has quietly owned since 1961. I work remotely, kayak most mornings before sunrise, and mostly keep to myself. I never once imagined that this same peaceful water would eventually become a battlefield. Cedar Hollow's Homeowners Association had always been particular about appearances, but under Diane Whitfield it had become something else entirely, something closer to a small, tightly managed kingdom. Diane had served as board president for 9 straight years, and in that time she'd fined neighbors for the wrong shade of mailbox paint and forced a widow 2 doors down to repaint her shutters twice within a single spring. People called her Diane behind cupped hands and the Colonel, whenever they thought no one else was listening closely. She wore tailored blazers even to casual backyard barbecues and carried a clipboard everywhere like a badge of quiet authority. Most residents simply paid whatever fine appeared unexpectedly in their mailbox rather than waste an evening arguing with her directly. I'd kept a polite distance from all of it for years, mostly by circumstance rather than any real strategy. My property technically bordered the subdivision but wasn't governed by most HOA rules. Since my grandfather's original parcel predated Cedar Hollow's development by 2 full decades. Diane never seemed to fully accept that boundary, and it clearly bothered her more than she ever admitted openly. Twice she'd mentioned, almost too casually over the community mailbox, that it would be nice if the lake could be a shared community amenity someday. I always laughed it off politely and moved on with my errands. The lake was mine, deeded and taxed in my name alone for years. I honestly didn't think a passing comment like that required any real defending. What I didn't know then was that Diane's late husband, Roy, had tried to buy this exact lake from my grandfather back in 1998, offering a low, almost insulting price and clearly expecting a quick, grateful yes in return. My grandfather turned him down flatly, calmly, and without apology, calling the offer disrespectful to his face in front of 2 other neighbors. Diane had married into that old grudge and, from what neighbors later told me privately, never quite managed to let it go over the following 2 decades. She'd mention my grandfather occasionally at meetings, voice suddenly tight, calling him difficult and stubborn, almost as though his decades-old rejection had happened to her directly rather than to a husband she'd buried years earlier. I didn't know any of that buried history yet. All I knew, at the time, was that Diane ran the HOA like a small, unquestioned kingdom, and lately her kingdom seemed to be running suspiciously short on money. Neighbors whispered quietly about special assessments and vague line items nobody could ever get fully explained during the actual meetings themselves. The community pool badly needed resurfacing. The clubhouse roof leaked steadily every spring, and twice the landscaping budget had mysteriously doubled without a single formal vote ever being taken on the matter. Diane always had an answer ready, smooth and endlessly confident, and residents mostly nodded along rather than dig any further into numbers she clearly preferred left alone. One board member, Linda Prescott, occasionally raised her hand with a careful, specific question about the budget during meetings. Diane always redirected the conversation smoothly before Linda could finish speaking, complimenting her passion for the community while sliding the topic elsewhere entirely. Linda would sit back down quietly and take notes nobody else in the room ever saw. I mostly stayed out of HOA business entirely, attending maybe one meeting a year out of politeness. I paid nothing to their association since my grandfather's parcel remained exempt, and I assumed that exemption would keep me safely outside Diane's orbit forever. That quiet assumption, I would soon learn, turned out to be the very first mistake I ever made in Cedar Hollow. Late that spring, a survey crew appeared near my shoreline without warning of any kind, driving stakes straight into the grass along what I'd always considered clearly, unquestionably my own property line. I walked down in my robe, coffee still warm in my hand, and asked the foreman calmly who exactly had sent them out to my land. He checked his clipboard slowly and said the order came directly from the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, requesting a boundary survey for potential community lake access. I told him politely, evenly, that the lake wasn't community property at all, and he simply shrugged and said he just followed whatever paperwork landed on his desk that morning. I called Diane that same afternoon, keeping my voice level even though my pulse certainly wasn't. She answered brightly, calling me Han as always, and explained the survey was just routine planning for a future amenities project the board was apparently exploring quietly. Nothing official yet, she assured me warmly, nothing at all worth worrying over. Something in her tone didn't sit right with me. Too rehearsed, too eager to close the call quickly. I let it go for the moment, telling myself Diane simply liked control more than she liked open conflict, and that surveys cost real money the HOA clearly didn't have to spare on speculative projects this year. A week later, a manila envelope appeared in my mailbox, HOA letterhead across the top. No stamp, clearly hand-delivered sometime overnight. Inside was a printed notice referring to Ashworth Lake Community Access Initiative, describing detailed plans for a shared dock, kayak rentals, and seasonal passes sold openly to residents and their invited guests. My name appeared nowhere on the notice, though my lake did, repeatedly, described throughout as though it already belonged jointly to everyone living in Cedar Hollow. I read it twice standing right at my mailbox, then a third time at my kitchen table, coffee gone completely cold beside the increasingly troubling document. I drafted a calm, careful email to the board that evening, attaching a scanned copy of my deed and explaining, once again clearly, that the lake was private property, not HOA land, and that any proposal involving it required my explicit consent, which I was very much not offering to anyone at this time. Diane replied within the hour, cheerful as ever, thanking me for raising a great point and promising the board would review the paperwork together at their earliest convenience. She didn't apologize, didn't withdraw the notice, and didn't answer a single specific question I had actually asked her directly in writing that evening. I should have pushed harder right then, in hindsight, rather than letting it slide. Instead, I told myself it was simply a misunderstanding that would quietly dissolve once someone actually read my deed carefully. Diane, I would soon learn the hard way. Rarely let inconvenient facts get in the way of a plan she'd already fully committed to. 2 uneasy weeks passed in quiet, watchful tension. Then Diane called an emergency board meeting. Agenda item 3 simply reading, Lake Amenity Update, and something in that careful wording made my stomach tighten uncomfortably the very moment I saw it posted on the community bulletin board that morning. I attended that meeting, folder in hand, deed copies printed and ready for every single board member seated around the table. Diane opened with a polished slideshow. Photos of my lake digitally edited into a glossy Cedar Hollow waterfront park rendering, complete with a snack shack, a rope swing, and smiling stock photo children. Neighbors murmured excitedly among themselves. Someone asked eagerly about swim lessons for their kids. Another mentioned organizing a summer fishing tournament. Diane beamed at the enthusiastic reaction, clearly having rehearsed this exact moment beforehand, gesturing at the render like a realtor confidently closing a sale on land she had never actually owned. When public comment finally opened, I stood and calmly explained, clearly and without raising my voice, that the lake was my private property, deeded to me individually years earlier, entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. I placed copies of the deed on the table and formally asked that the Lake Amenity Update be struck from any future agenda entirely. Diane's smile didn't waver even slightly. She said the board had separate documentation, suggesting a historical shared access easement existed somewhere along the shoreline, something her late husband had apparently referenced years earlier in old community files, and that legal counsel was reviewing that documentation currently, though no timeline was offered. I'd never once heard of any easement in 6 full years of owning the property myself, and my grandfather certainly never mentioned one across 50 years of quiet ownership before that. I asked to see this mysterious documentation directly. Diane said it would be shared once council finished their review, then moved briskly on to the next agenda item. A few neighbors looked at me sympathetically afterward, but most seemed genuinely swept up in the fantasy of a free waterfront park appearing behind their houses. One man actually thanked me on his way out the door, assuming I generously agreed to donate lake access for the good of the entire community. I corrected him gently and watched his expression shift slowly from gratitude to confusion to something closer to quiet suspicion, as though I were somehow the unreasonable one for refusing to simply hand over 30 private acres my grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting from exactly this kind of pressure. That night I called a real estate attorney, Mr. Halloway, who'd helped settle my grandfather's estate years earlier. He reviewed the deed carefully over the phone and laughed, not unkindly, saying it was about as airtight as documents ever got, with absolutely no easement language appearing anywhere in the full chain of title. He told me not to panic yet, that HOAs sometimes floated ambitious ideas that never survived a single firm lawyer's letter, and offered to draft one on my behalf right away. I agreed gratefully, relieved to finally have something concrete to hold on to besides Diane's endless, rehearsed reassurances over the phone. The letter went out that Friday morning, polite but unmistakably firm, stating clearly that the lake remained private property and any further HOA communication implying shared ownership would be treated as a formal legal matter going forward. I genuinely expected that to end things quickly. It didn't end anything at all. Within days, a brand new flyer appeared on community mailboxes. This one titled Community Waterfront Fund, inviting residents to reserve early access passes for $50 each, refundable pending finalization of amenity agreements. My lake was apparently being sold before anyone involved had actually asked me a single thing about it. I found out because my sweet, oblivious neighbor Carol handed me 2 crumpled $20 bills and asked which day the pontoon rentals would start. Since she and her grandkids wanted first pick of the schedule, Diane had confidently promised at the previous meeting only weeks earlier. I told Carol gently that no rentals existed anywhere, that the lake wasn't for sale or leased to anyone, and watched her face fall into confused disappointment, as though I'd personally taken something valuable away from her that Diane, in truth, had never actually owned to give in the first place. That was the exact moment I realized Diane wasn't simply confused or misinformed about the situation. She was actively collecting real money from trusting neighbors for access to property that wasn't hers, based on an easement she'd never once produced, and a survey she'd ordered months earlier without my permission at all. I called Mr. immediately, and this time his tone sharpened considerably over the phone. Collecting funds under false pretenses tied to a specific, identifiable parcel wasn't just a simple boundary dispute anymore, he explained carefully. Depending on how it was structured legally, could edge dangerously close to outright fraud. He advised documenting absolutely everything from that point forward. Every flyer, every email, every dollar collected from residents, before sending a second, far more formal letter demanding Diane cease all waterfront fund activity immediately and issue prompt refunds to every single resident who had already paid into it. I spent that entire weekend photographing flyers pulled off mailbox posts, screenshotting the HOA's private Facebook group where Diane had posted the glossy rendering with a caption reading, "Coming soon, thanks to generous community leadership." No mention anywhere of me, my grandfather, or the actual deed sitting in my file cabinet. Comments underneath the post gushed with genuine excitement from residents. A few, mostly Linda Prescott among them, asked pointed, specific questions about ownership and legal status. Diane replied to each one with vague, cheerful reassurances, then quietly deleted 2 of Linda's more direct comments overnight, though I'd already carefully saved screenshots of everything. Linda messaged me privately after that incident, the very first time we'd ever actually spoken directly to each other outside of formal meetings. She said something had felt off about the whole initiative for months, that Diane had been cagey about specific numbers for weeks, and that she'd already started keeping her own careful notes just in case. I thanked her, cautiously at first, still unsure how far I could trust a board member who had, after all, sat silently through meetings where my lake was sold like a theme park attraction to an unsuspecting crowd. Still, it was the very first genuine crack of daylight in a wall that had felt entirely solid. Mr. And sharper letter landed on Diane's desk that following Tuesday morning, citing potential fraud in the collection of waterfront fund deposits and demanding an immediate, complete accounting of every dollar received so far from residents across the community. I expected panic in return. Instead, Diane escalated in a direction I hadn't remotely anticipated. She called another emergency meeting almost immediately, this one framed publicly as an HOA unity session, and opened by describing me, without ever using my actual name aloud, as a resident attempting to obstruct improvements the entire community deserves. Several neighbors quietly turned around in their chairs to look at me directly. I stayed composed throughout, though my chest genuinely burned with the sheer injustice of being cast as the villain in my own family's story. Diane produced a single crisp page, claiming it was an authentic 1979 shared access agreement between the original developer and my grandfather's estate at the time. The signature at the bottom looked deliberately smudged, The paper itself suspiciously crisp for something supposedly 40 years old, and the letterhead referenced a development company that, according to a quick search on my phone right there in the meeting, hadn't actually existed until 1985, 6 full years after the supposed agreement was signed. I pointed this discrepancy out calmly, and the room went quiet in a noticeably different way than before. Diane insisted it was just a copy and the original was with counsel. The exact same excuse she'd offered weeks earlier for documentation that apparently never once materialized for anyone to review. Afterward, 3 separate neighbors approached me privately, apologizing quietly for doubting me earlier that evening. One man admitted Diane had personally asked him to keep an eye on me and report anything I said about the lake at community gatherings, framing me deliberately as uncooperative and difficult to work with. I started to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, the true scope of what I was actually dealing with here. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding about property lines at all. Diane was carefully building a narrative, brick by brick, positioning herself as the reasonable community leader and me as the selfish outsider blocking obvious progress. The HOA's private monthly newsletter that month featured a prominent section titled, "Working Toward Waterfront Access," carefully worded to avoid outright lies while still strongly implying steady momentum toward a shared lake that, legally speaking, remained entirely and exclusively mine. Diane was clearly skilled at this kind of technically true deception. I began keeping my own detailed file, mirroring Linda's careful approach, saving every newsletter, every flyer, and every Facebook post I could find. Mr. I also formally request Diane's board meeting minutes and financial records through the HOA's official document request process, a right every resident technically held under the bylaws. Diane, as board president, was legally required to respond within 30 days under the association's own bylaws. She didn't respond at all within that window. When I followed up, her assistant treasurer cited vague, administrative delays and promised the records soon, a promise that quietly evaporated over the following several weeks without explanation. Meanwhile, the survey crew returned unannounced once again, this time driving stakes even closer to my actual dock. Close enough that I later found one lodged directly beside my kayak rack. I called the survey company directly and learned that Diane had personally authorized this newly expanded scope without telling me at all. I confronted her about it over email that same evening, copying Mr. Holloway on the message. Her response was breezy, almost amused in tone, saying the board simply wanted accurate measurements for planning purposes, and that I was overreacting to routine due diligence any responsible association would naturally perform for its members. Something about her unwavering confidence unsettled me far more than anger ever could have. She wasn't scrambling to cover herself defensively. She seemed genuinely certain this would all work out entirely in her favor eventually, as though she knew something I still didn't, or simply believed she did with total conviction. Linda reached out again soon after, this time with something far more concrete to share. She'd found an old HOA financial summary, quietly filed away years earlier, showing a waterfront development reserve that had existed since Roy Whitfield's own time on the board, funded partially through steadily inflated landscaping invoices over several years. The reserve had grown to nearly $80,000 over the years, according to Linda's careful notes, yet no actual waterfront project had ever materialized once, and no audit had ever seriously questioned where those inflated invoice differences actually went once the original vendors themselves had already been fully paid off. I asked Linda why she was choosing to help me now, after years of quiet compliance with Diane's leadership. She admitted she'd always suspected something wasn't quite right, but lacked hard proof and genuinely worried about retaliation from the board. Watching Diane target someone directly, she said, finally pushed her past that lingering fear. Diane, entirely unaware of Linda's growing private doubts, pressed forward publicly and confidently. She scheduled a formal community vote on the Waterfront Access Initiative for the following month, framing it deliberately as democratic process even though the lake in question legally required no community vote whatsoever under state law. I hired a second attorney, this one specializing specifically in HOA governance disputes, who confirmed clearly that any vote regarding property the association didn't actually own would carry zero legal weight whatsoever. Still, he warned carefully, a lopsided public community vote could create dangerous social pressure and lasting reputational damage regardless of the legal outcome. Diane began a quiet campaign leading up to the vote, stopping neighbors casually in their driveways, mentioning offhand at the mailbox how some people cared more about personal gain than genuine community spirit. She never once said my name outright, but everyone in the neighborhood understood exactly who she meant by it. A few residents started noticeably avoiding eye contact with me near the community mailbox after that. One mother pulled her kids slightly closer as I walked by one afternoon, as though Diane's careful insinuations had already convicted me of some vague, unnamed selfishness in the quiet court of Cedar Hollow public opinion. It hurt more than I honestly expected it to. I'd lived here quietly for years, waved at these very same neighbors every single morning, brought soup over when someone was sick nearby. Watching Diane erase all of that goodwill with a few pointed comments taught me exactly how fragile community trust actually could be. Linda kept feeding me small pieces of information quietly, always careful never to be seen speaking with me too long in public places. She mentioned Diane had recently met privately with a man named Marcus Reyes, introduced at one board meeting only briefly as a waterfront development consultant, with no further details offered. I searched Marcus Reyes online that same night and found almost nothing substantial about him anywhere. A sparse LinkedIn page, a company called Blue Point Shoreline Partners with no address listed beyond a P.O. box in a neighboring county, and no verifiable completed projects anywhere in his professional history that I could actually find. Something about Blue Point felt hollow to me, like scaffolding carefully built around absolutely nothing solid. I forwarded everything I'd found to Mr. Holloway, who agreed it warranted a much closer look, particularly given how quickly Diane seemed eager to involve an outside consultant in a lake she still didn't actually own. The community vote finally arrived on a warm Thursday evening, the clubhouse packed tighter than I'd ever personally seen it before. Diane stood confidently at the podium in a crisp white blazer, thanking everyone warmly for their continued patience as the initiative moved toward what she called its exciting final stage. I sat near the back with Mr. Holloway, deed copies neatly organized in a folder on my lap, watching Diane present another glossy rendering, this one prominently, crediting Blue Point Shoreline Partners as the development partner, who would fund construction in exchange for long-term lake access rights over the property. When public comment finally opened again, I stood and calmly reiterated, slowly and clearly for the entire room, that the lake remained my sole legal property, that no easement document had ever actually been produced despite repeated formal requests, and that any vote taken tonight carried absolutely no binding legal authority whatsoever. Diane's expression flickered, just slightly, before she smoothly recovered with practiced ease, telling the room the vote was merely symbolic, meant to show the board community support, while legal details were being finalized separately behind the scenes. The room, eager for a promised lake, voted overwhelmingly in favor anyway. I watched hands rise steadily around me. Neighbors I'd known for years, voting enthusiastically to claim something that had never once belonged to them, swept along entirely by a glossy rendering and a confident smile. Diane thanked everyone warmly afterward, then looked directly at me for the very first time all night. "Progress," she said simply into the microphone, "sometimes requires patience from everyone involved." The room applauded loudly. I gathered my folder quietly, said absolutely nothing, and walked out into the parking lot, cold night air hitting my face like the first honest thing that had happened all evening long. The weeks immediately after the vote grew strangely, unexpectedly quiet. No new flyers appeared anywhere. No survey crews returned to my property. And Diane's Facebook posts shifted back toward ordinary HOA business. Pool schedules and landscaping updates, as though the entire waterfront initiative had simply paused, mid-breath, without any real explanation. Mr. The sudden quiet wasn't retreat but rather careful recalibration. Likely legal counsel finally reading the actual situation clearly and advising Diane to slow things down considerably. I wanted badly to believe it was over. But something about her strange parting words at the meeting kept nagging at me constantly. I used that quiet lull to dig deeper into county records myself, cross-referencing property tax filings, deed histories, and old development plats from the 1970s, searching carefully for anything resembling the shared access agreement Diane had waved around so confidently without ever once producing an actual original copy for anyone to inspect. The county clerk's office had absolutely no record of any easement filed against my grandfather's parcel, ever, in any decade whatsoever. Whatever document Diane had shown that crowded room had either been entirely fabricated or simply never legally recorded anywhere, which meant it was completely worthless as evidence either way. Linda continued passing me small pieces of the growing financial puzzle, always careful and quiet about it. She'd found reimbursement requests submitted personally by Diane, tied directly to waterfront initiative consulting fees, paid straight to Blue Point Shoreline Partners over the past 4 months alone, totaling nearly $11,000 in unauthorized spending. $11,000. Spent entirely without a single board vote ever authorizing it. Funneled to a consultant with almost no verifiable footprint anywhere online. For a project involving land the HOA didn't legally control in the first place. Even in the sudden quiet, Diane's fingerprints kept spreading across numbers that simply didn't add up. I met Linda for coffee outside the neighborhood for the very first time, somewhere Diane wouldn't recognize either of our parked cars nearby. She admitted quietly she was genuinely scared, that Diane had hinted at consequences for board members who undermined community initiatives during a recent tense private phone call between them. I asked carefully what kind of consequences she meant specifically. Linda said Diane had mentioned, almost casually in passing, that HOA bylaws technically allowed removal of board members for conduct detrimental to association goals. A vague clause Diane had apparently used once before years ago against a member who'd questioned her too closely. That particular detail chilled me far more than any lake dispute alone ever had. Diane wasn't simply overreaching on one isolated project. She'd built an entire system over 9 long years designed specifically to punish anyone who looked too closely, and it had clearly worked, since almost nobody had ever dared to look. Mr. Did we formally request a full financial audit through the HOA's own bylaws? a right technically available to any group of residents meeting a minimum petition threshold. Linda offered to help gather signatures quietly, careful to frame the effort as routine transparency rather than any kind of direct personal attack. We collected signatures steadily over the following 10 days. Neighbor by neighbor, careful conversations happening at kitchen tables and quiet front porches. Several residents, still visibly embarrassed about the earlier vote, signed readily enough, admitting privately they'd felt manipulated by the glossy renderings and hadn't questioned the specific details closely enough at the time. By the time we finally submitted the audit petition, we had 31 solid signatures, comfortably past the threshold required under the bylaws. Diane would now have 30 full days to comply or formally explain, on the official record, why an independent audit of her 9 years of financial leadership simply couldn't proceed. Diane's response arrived exactly 4 days later, not directed to me personally, but posted publicly in the HOA newsletter, framing the audit petition as an unfortunate distraction driven by a disgruntled resident with a personal grudge against community progress. My name, once again, conspicuously absent but entirely unmistakable to anyone reading it. She announced the audit would proceed in due time, while simultaneously scheduling an entirely new event, a Founders Appreciation fundraiser, honoring her late husband, Roy's supposed decades of quiet service to Cedar Hollow, complete with a silent auction and, buried carefully in the fine print, waterfront-themed raffle prizes for winners. I attended, mostly to watch quietly, mostly out of sheer disbelief at what I was seeing unfold. Diane stood at a podium decorated with old photos of Roy, describing his vision for a shared community lake. A vision she said she was simply finishing on his behalf, framing herself as a grieving widow completing sacred, unfinished work. Several neighbors dabbed at their eyes emotionally during her speech. It was, I had to grudgingly admit, a masterful performance, reframing an entire fraudulent land grab as a heartfelt tribute to a dead man's dream. Watching her work that crowded room so skillfully, I finally understood how she'd controlled this neighborhood unchallenged for 9 straight years. Afterward, an older resident named Mr. Petrov approached me quietly near the parking lot as everyone filtered out. He'd lived in Cedar Hollow since long before the HOA even existed and remembered Roy Whitfield clearly, describing him not as visionary at all but as a man obsessed with getting that lake one way or another. Roy had apparently tried repeatedly throughout the late 90s. Mr. Petrov explained quietly, offering my grandfather increasingly lowball prices, then threatening vague legal action, then eventually giving up entirely when my grandfather simply stopped answering his calls altogether. Roy, by Mr. Petrov's honest account, never truly forgave that rejection for the rest of his life. Diane took that grudge personal, Mr. Petrov said, shaking his head slowly. Roy's been gone 12 years now, and she's still fighting his old fight for him. It was the very first time anyone had confirmed, out loud and clearly, that this entire ordeal had roots stretching back decades before I'd even personally learned to swim in this lake. I thanked him quietly, genuinely shaken by how much sudden sense it all made together. This wasn't really about waterfront parks or community amenities at all. It was inherited resentment, carefully dressed up in fundraiser banners and glossy renderings, aimed squarely at the granddaughter of the man who'd once simply told Roy Whitfield no. That night, I told Linda everything Mr. Petrov had quietly shared with me. She went silent for a long moment on the phone, then admitted Diane had mentioned Roy's unfinished business more than once during private board conversations, always with a strange, unsettling intensity Linda had previously chalked up simply to lingering grief until now. Grief, turned out, made an excellent disguise for genuine obsession. Diane wasn't simply an overzealous HOA president chasing new amenities. She was quietly finishing a decades-old score, using community funds, forged documents, and a fabricated consultant to finally claim what her own husband had never once managed to secure himself. The audit deadline crept steadily closer, and Diane grew visibly tighter and sharper at every meeting, quicker to cut off inconvenient questions from the floor. She announced Blue Point Shoreline Partners had submitted a formal purchase interest letter for the lake, contingent entirely on the HOA securing clear community authority over the property first. The letter itself, when Linda managed to photograph a stray copy left carelessly on the printer, listed a purchase price of $600,000, payable directly to the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association. Not to me, the actual legal owner of every single acre of water being casually sold off in the document. Mr. Quite plainly, an attempted theft dressed carefully in corporate letterhead. Selling property you don't legally own, while actively collecting payment for it, required either staggering incompetence or fully deliberate fraud, and Diane's carefully worded documents strongly suggested she understood exactly what she was attempting to pull off here. I asked him carefully what would actually happen if the HOA truly tried to close that proposed sale. He explained patiently that legally, nothing would ever transfer, since I held clear, unquestionable title, but the money itself, once collected from residents, could vanish long before anyone untangled the resulting legal mess afterward. That specific possibility terrified me far more than any survey stake ever had. Diane didn't actually need the sale to hold up legally in court at all. She simply needed it to close long enough for $600,000 to move somewhere she personally controlled, before anyone even thought to check the deed carefully. Linda began quietly copying every financial document she could access as assistant treasurer, always careful never to remove any originals, only photographing pages during late evenings when the HOA office sat completely empty. Each new page she found confirmed what we'd already suspected, a pattern years deep and carefully, deliberately hidden all along. Blue Point Shoreline Partners, turned out, shared a mailing address with a defunct landscaping company Diane had used for years, the very same company responsible for those steadily inflated invoices Linda had flagged months earlier. The separate threads weren't actually separate at all anymore. They were, in fact, the exact same rope. I brought everything we'd gathered to Mr. Holloway, who in turn brought in a forensic accountant he trusted deeply, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya who specialized specifically in HOA fraud cases. She reviewed Linda's careful photographs for less than an hour before calmly calling the pattern textbook shell company laundering outright. Priya explained patiently that Blue Point likely existed only on paper, a rented mailbox and a single bank account, designed specifically to receive funds that looked legitimate on the surface while ultimately flowing right back to whoever actually controlled it. Given the shared address, that person appeared, quite clearly, to be Diane herself. I sat with that heavy information for a long time that night, watching the lake slowly go dark outside my window. The very same water Diane wanted to sell for $600,000 she had absolutely no legal right to collect. My grandfather's water. My own family's water, threatened by pure greed. Priya recommended firmly that we not confront Diane directly just yet, warning carefully that premature exposure often gave fraudsters valuable time to destroy records or quietly move money before authorities could properly act. Better, she said, to gather everything patiently and quietly, then deliver it all complete, undeniable, all at once together, Mr. Completely, suggesting we let the public audit process play out normally while Priya and Linda continued working privately behind the scenes, building a case Diane wouldn't see coming until it was already sitting in front of the entire board and every single resident who'd once trusted her completely. 2 full weeks before the audit deadline, Diane abruptly moved up the sale vote entirely, announcing a final waterfront approval meeting scheduled for the following Saturday, framing it urgently as necessary since Blue Point had supposedly threatened to withdraw interest if the community didn't act quickly enough on the opportunity presented. Urgency, Priya noted dryly during our next call, was the oldest trick in the entire fraud playbook. Nothing pressured ordinary people into skipping careful review faster than the genuine fear of losing a good deal. And Diane clearly understood that particular pressure worked especially well on neighbors already excited about a promised free lake. I asked Priya and Mr. actually had enough solid evidence to act meaningfully before Saturday arrived. Priya said the financial trail was strong but not yet fully airtight, and she wanted 72 more careful hours to trace Blue Point's bank account fully back through the state business registry records. Linda, meanwhile, discovered something entirely unexpected while quietly organizing old board files for the upcoming audit. A plain folder labeled simply RW. Notes, containing Roy Whitfield's handwritten correspondence from the late 90s, including a draft threat letter to my grandfather that had apparently never actually been sent to him. In it, Roy had written that if my grandfather wouldn't sell willingly, there are other ways to make a lake change hands eventually. Linda photographed the page immediately, her hands shaking slightly, fully understanding she was now holding physical proof this entire vendetta had existed quietly for over 20 full years already. I stared at that photograph for a long time afterward. My grandfather's old, firm rejection finally fully explained in his old rival's own handwriting. Diane hadn't invented this obsession herself. She'd inherited it whole, and apparently intended to finish what Roy had only ever threatened. Decades after his own quiet death, Priya's bank trace came back faster than any of us expected, and it was considerably worse than anyone had anticipated. Blue Point Shoreline Partners account had been opened only 8 months earlier, funded initially by a $4,000 transfer coming directly from an account registered under Diane Whitfield's own personal name. Every subsequent consulting fee the HOA had paid Blue Point had flowed right back out again within days, split carefully between a mortgage payment on Diane's own house and a separate account Priya couldn't immediately identify, hidden behind yet another shell entity registered quietly in a neighboring state entirely. We were no longer simply looking at a boundary dispute or even ordinary fraud anymore. We were looking at years of careful embezzlement, funneled through fake invoices, a fabricated consultant, and now an attempted $600,000 sale of property Diane never legally owned, all timed carefully to cover something even bigger underneath. Priya suspected the sudden urgency wasn't really just about the lake anymore at all. She believed Diane needed that sale money urgently to cover a shortfall the actual audit would eventually expose, a hole that had likely been growing quietly for years beneath every single inflated invoice and phantom consulting fee. Mr. acted the county district attorney's office quietly that week, laying out everything we had gathered so far, careful not to tip off Diane through any official HOA channel where word might travel back to her before Saturday's meeting arrived and the vote actually proceeded as planned. The DA's office assigned an investigator promptly, a calm, methodical man named Detective Reyes. No relation at all to the fictional Marcus Reyes Diane had apparently invented, who reviewed our full documentation and agreed the pattern clearly warranted a formal inquiry. Though he cautioned that fraud cases moved carefully, never quickly, Detective Reyes asked us specifically not to confront Diane before Saturday, explaining that a public exposure at the meeting itself, witnessed by dozens of residents together, would create an ideal, undeniable record for future prosecution far stronger than any private accusation delivered quietly behind closed doors instead. I agreed reluctantly, unsettled deeply by the idea of sitting through several more days of Diane's confident performance knowing exactly what she'd actually done behind the scenes. But I understood the careful strategy. Saturday's meeting, the one meant to finalize her theft, would instead become the stage where it all unraveled completely. Linda continued attending board meetings normally throughout that week, careful to betray absolutely nothing about what she knew. Diane, energized by the approaching final vote, grew almost giddy, mentioning at one meeting that she'd already spoken to a contractor about clearing brush for the new dock before any sale had even legally closed. Her unwavering confidence, in hindsight, made a strange kind of sense to me. She'd spent 9 full years unchallenged, watching every previous concern quietly dissolve under her practiced charm and endless paperwork. She had no real reason yet to believe this particular dispute would end any differently than every other battle she'd already won. I spent that entire week gathering my own materials too. Deed copies, county records, Mr. Holloway's letters, and copies of every flyer and Facebook post Diane had ever made claiming ownership over water she'd never legally touched at all. If Saturday was going to be her stage, I intended to be fully ready. Priya finished tracing the second shell account 2 full days before the meeting, confirming it led directly to a personal savings account Diane had opened shortly after Roy's death, one that had received irregular deposits totaling nearly $40,000 over the preceding 18 months alone. Detective Reyes said it was more than enough to justify his quiet attendance Saturday. Plain clothes, simply observing rather than intervening unless it became absolutely necessary. He asked Mr. our evidence clearly and let the numbers speak for themselves, promising to step in once the full picture was complete. I barely slept at all that Friday night, running through what I'd say, how exactly I'd say it, worried I'd freeze in front of a room that had, weeks earlier, applauded Diane's fantasy renderings without asking a single hard question. This time, I told myself firmly, the plain facts would speak far louder than any rendering. Linda texted me early that Saturday morning. One short line, I brought everything. See you there. For a long moment, deeply grateful for a woman who'd spent months quietly risking Diane's considerable wrath, one carefully photographed document at a time, until the entire case finally built itself whole. Ashley Whitfield, Diane's adult daughter, reached out to me unexpectedly that same morning, a name I only recognized vaguely from old Facebook photos years earlier. She said she urgently needed to talk before the meeting started, her voice tight and strained over the phone, mentioning she'd found something troubling in her mother's home office. We met briefly at a quiet coffee shop an hour before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Ashley slid a thick folder across the small table toward me, bank statements she'd found while helping her mother organize paperwork. Statements that matched almost exactly what Priya had already independently traced through official channels weeks earlier. Ashley admitted quietly she'd suspected something was wrong for months now, watching her mother grow increasingly evasive about money at home, but hadn't wanted to fully believe it until finally seeing the raw numbers herself in black and white. "She always said this was for Dad," Ashley said softly. "I don't think it was ever really about him." We arrived at the clubhouse together that afternoon. Mr. Holloway, Linda, Priya's carefully prepared summary tucked into my folder, and Ashley walking a few nervous steps behind us, visibly anxious about facing her own mother in a room full of neighbors who still fully believed Diane was fighting bravely for them. The clubhouse was packed even tighter than the previous vote had been. Folding chairs added hastily along every wall, a nervous excitement buzzing steadily through the waiting crowd. Diane stood confidently at the podium in a brand new white blazer, practically glowing with certainty, clearly convinced this evening would end in triumphant, applauded victory. She opened by thanking everyone warmly for their continued patience, describing Blue Point's generous offer as a genuine gift to the community, a rare chance to finally honor Roy's vision after all these long years. Several neighbors nodded, visibly moved, unaware they were watching the final act of a decade-long personal grudge play out. Diane called formally for a vote to authorize the HOA to finalize the waterfront access agreement, gesturing confidently toward a projected purchase agreement glowing on the screen behind her.
$600,000, payable directly to the association, pending clear title transfer. She assured everyone was already smoothly underway behind the scenes.
I stood before the vote could formally open, folder held firmly in hand, and asked politely to address the room one final time regarding the agreement's basic legal validity. Diane's confident smile flickered, just slightly, the same flicker I'd noticed weeks earlier, before she gestured for me to proceed, dismissive and entirely confident still. I began simply and clearly, restating that the lake remained deeded solely and entirely to me, that no easement had ever actually existed anywhere in county records, and that any legitimate sale of the property required my personal signature, which Blue Point's agreement, glowing brightly on the screen, notably did not include anywhere at all. Diane interrupted quickly, reminding the room that legal details were being handled entirely separately, that tonight's vote was simply about general community authorization. I let her finish speaking, then asked the room a different, sharper question entirely. Had anyone actually bothered to verify who really owned Blue Point Shoreline Partners in the first place? A low murmur moved steadily through the crowd. Diane's expression tightened noticeably as I opened my folder and read aloud the registered agent listed on Blue Point's official state filing. An address that matched, precisely and unmistakably, the exact same landscaping company responsible for years of inflated HOA invoices under Diane's direct personal oversight. "That's absurd," Diane said quickly, her voice sharper now, clearly losing its usual practiced warmth. "Blue Point is an independent firm. Marcus Reyes has been in direct contact with our board for months now." I asked calmly whether anyone in the entire room had ever actually met this Marcus Reyes in person. Even once. Silence answered that particular question far more clearly than any words ever could have. Not a single board member, not even Diane herself apparently, had ever once sat across from this mysterious consultant supposedly investing $600,000 into their community. He existed, seemed, only within carefully prepared documents on a page. Priya stood next, introducing herself calmly as a licensed forensic accountant, and methodically presented the full financial trail she'd carefully built. The shell account funded by Diane's own personal transfer, the consulting fees cycling steadily back into Diane's mortgage payments, the second hidden account quietly growing since Roy's death years earlier. The room, moments earlier excited about promised waterfront parks, went utterly silent, the kind of heavy silence that somehow felt far heavier than any shouting could have. Diane's hands gripped the podium's edge tightly, knuckles pale, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking visibly in front of the very neighbors who'd trusted her for years. "This is a coordinated attack," Diane said, her voice rising sharply, orchestrated by someone who's always resented this community's genuine progress. She pointed directly toward me, and for one brief moment the old familiar script almost worked again. A few faces in the crowd turning my way with old, learned suspicion returning briefly. Then Linda stood slowly, folder trembling slightly in her careful hands, and said she could personally confirm every single document Priya had just presented, having photographed the actual originals herself over the past 2 full months while serving as assistant treasurer, watching money move exactly the way Priya had just calmly described to the room. Diane's eyes snapped toward Linda with something close to genuine betrayal, as if loyalty had somehow been owed to her rather than ever earned through honest leadership. "You've been spying," Diane hissed sharply, no longer performing at all for the watching room, the mask fully gone now, replaced entirely by raw, uncontained fury. "I've been doing the job you never let anyone else actually do," Linda replied steadily, despite her visibly shaking hands. "Reading the actual numbers." A few residents in the crowd actually applauded softly at that. The very first genuine crack in 9 long years of Diane's unquestioned control over this exact room. Ashley stepped forward last of all, and the room's collective shock deepened even further, many recognizing her instantly as Diane's own adult daughter. She held up the bank statements she'd found at home, quietly confirming the exact deposits Priya had already described, her voice barely steady but still clear enough for everyone present to hear. "I found these in Dad's old office," Ashley said carefully. "I didn't want to believe it either, honestly. But it's real. Mom. This has to stop now." Daughter for a long, silent moment, something in her face finally collapsing that no number of blazers could ever rebuild again. "You don't understand what your father truly wanted," Diane said quietly, almost to herself now, all the fight visibly draining from her voice. "I was finishing it." Ashley shook her head slowly, tears finally falling freely. "He's been gone 12 years. Mom. This was never really for him at all." Detective Reyes stepped forward calmly from the back of the crowded room then, badge clearly visible, voice calm and entirely procedural, informing Diane that given the extensive evidence just presented, he'd be formally requesting she accompany him for questioning regarding suspected fraud and misappropriation of association funds over several years. The room erupted immediately, not exactly in applause, but in a wave of stunned murmurs sweeping through the crowd, neighbors turning quickly to each other, mentally replaying 9 years of fines and assessments and glossy renderings through an entirely new, far uglier lens. Someone near the back said simply, "I knew something was off." Diane didn't resist at all, though her composure cracked entirely as Detective Reyes escorted her calmly toward the door. Past neighbors who'd applauded her waterfront vision enthusiastically only weeks earlier, now watching in a silence far heavier than any accusation I could ever have leveled at her myself that evening alone. At the doorway, she turned back briefly, her eyes finding mine across the crowded, silent room. "Your grandfather should have just sold it," she said, voice flat and almost hollow now. None of this had to happen at all. I didn't answer her. There was truly nothing left worth saying to her at that point. The meeting dissolved into total chaos after she was let out. Board members scrambling anxiously, neighbors demanding immediate answers, Linda quietly directing people toward Mr. Holloway and Priya for the actual documented facts rather than spreading rumor. It took nearly 2 full hours before the clubhouse finally, slowly, began to empty out completely. Ashley stayed behind after almost everyone else had already gone home, sitting alone near the back row, staring at nothing in particular.
I sat beside her for a moment.
Genuinely unsure what comfort I could possibly offer the daughter of the woman who'd spent months trying to steal my grandfather's beloved lake. "Thank you," I said finally, quietly. "For tonight. For you at all." Ashley wiped her eyes slowly and shook her head. "She wasn't always like this," she said softly. "I think losing Dad broke something inside her, and it just kept getting worse and nobody ever stopped it in time." I understood, in some strange way, that grief and grievance had tangled together tightly inside Diane until neither one made any sense without the other anymore, until stealing a lake somehow felt, to her, like finishing an act of love rather than committing outright theft. It didn't excuse anything at all. It only explained it. The following morning, county investigators arrived at the HOA office with a proper warrant, working closely alongside Priya to formally document years of financial records, the inflated invoices, the shell accounts, the phantom consulting fees, everything Linda had spent months quietly and carefully photographing in complete secret. Diane was formally charged within the week that followed. Embezzlement, fraud, and forgery among the listed counts, tied directly to the fabricated 1979 easement document, the fake Blue Point agreement, and years of association funds quietly diverted into personal accounts under her exclusive control as longtime board president. News of it all spread through Cedar Hollow faster than any HOA newsletter ever had in 9 years. Neighbors who'd avoided my eyes weeks earlier now stopped by my house with quiet apologies. Some sheepish, some genuinely emotional, admitting they'd let Diane's unwavering confidence override their own common sense for far too long. Carol, the same neighbor who'd once handed me $40 for pontoon passes, showed up on my porch with a warm pie and tears in her eyes, apologizing sincerely for ever doubting me at all. I told her, honestly and gently, that Diane had fooled far sharper people than either of us combined. "Mr. I too, quieter than usual, simply nodding once toward my dock and saying, 'Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled all that.' I didn't trust myself to answer without my voice breaking completely, so I just nodded back silently and let the quiet moment settle between us. The HOA scrambled quickly to hold an emergency board election, and Linda, reluctant at first but urged strongly by nearly every resident who'd learned what she'd risked, finally agreed to step in as interim president, promising a full independent audit and transparent quarterly financial reports going forward from that point on. I attended that very first meeting under Linda's new leadership, watching a room that had once applauded fabricated waterfront renderings now ask careful, specific questions about every single line item on the budget. Felt, finally, like the kind of genuine oversight this community should have had all along. Years earlier, Blue Point Shoreline Partners dissolved quietly within weeks of the arrest. Its bank accounts frozen pending the ongoing investigation. Its supposed $600,000 purchase agreement rendered exactly as worthless as it had always secretly been, since it was never legally binding on land Diane had never actually owned in the first place. Detective Reyes kept me periodically updated as the case moved steadily through the legal system, explaining that forensic accounting had traced nearly $91,000 in total misappropriated funds across 4 full years, considerably more than even Priya's careful initial estimate had suggested during her very first quick review. Diane's attorney attempted an early plea negotiation, framing the fraud carefully as grief-driven mismanagement rather than deliberate theft. But the fabricated easement document and other forged elements made that particular argument very difficult to sustain once handwriting analysis confirmed the signature had been traced directly from an old HOA form. I sat through 2 separate pretrial hearings, mostly out of a personal need to see the whole process through completely, watching Diane appear noticeably smaller each time, stripped entirely of the blazers and clipboard authority that had once made her seem untouchable inside Cedar Hollow's quiet, manicured little streets. Ashley attended every single hearing too, sitting a respectful distance away from me each time, occasionally exchanging a brief, quiet nod between us. She'd moved out of her mother's house entirely by then, staying with a close friend across town. Unable, she told me once in the hallway, to keep living inside those walls anymore. Priya's full financial report became formal evidence eventually, laid out with careful, unemotional precision. Every inflated invoice traced back to its original source. Every shell transfer mapped out chronologically. Reading it felt like watching 9 full years of careful manipulation finally rendered small and ordinary on plain, ruled accounting paper. Linda, meanwhile, worked steadily to rebuild everything Diane had quietly hollowed out over the years, recovering association funds wherever possible, restructuring the vendor approval process so no single board member could ever authorize large payments alone again. A basic safeguard that should have existed from the very beginning of the association. The community, thoroughly humbled by everything, began treating routine oversight very differently going forward. More residents attending regular meetings. More questions asked openly before any vote. A genuine cultural shift born directly from watching how easily unchecked authority had nearly cost someone her family's entire legacy over a lake that was never for sale. I met with Mr. closed the legal chapter concerning my property once and for all, filing paperwork that permanently and publicly clarified the lake's exact boundaries in county records, eliminating any future ambiguity someone might try to exploit the exact way Diane and Roy once had years apart. We also explored together, at Mr. Halloway's careful suggestion, placing the lake under a conservation easement of my own personal choosing, one that would protect it permanently from any future development while still allowing me full private use. A decision entirely mine alone, unlike the forced version Diane had once tried to impose on me. I liked the idea immediately and completely. It felt like closing a door Roy Whitfield had first tried to force open decades earlier, ensuring no future HOA president, no matter how ambitious or quietly resentful, could ever again dangle my grandfather's water in front of a hopeful, unsuspecting crowd of neighbors. The conservation nonprofit sent an appraiser out to walk the entire shoreline with me one afternoon. And standing there together, watching herons lift gracefully off the water at dusk, I felt something finally settle inside me that had been tense and coiled tightly since the survey stakes first appeared months earlier that spring. Linda called one quiet evening to tell me the independent audit had officially concluded at last, confirming every single figure Priya had carefully traced, and that the HOA's insurance carrier had agreed to cover a meaningful portion of the missing funds, softening what could have been a much heavier financial blow to residents overall. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought near the end of our call, that several neighbors had proposed renaming the community garden after Priya and me together, a gesture I found both genuinely touching and slightly absurd, given all I'd really done was refuse to let someone steal what was already rightfully mine. I declined the honor gently but firmly, suggesting instead they name it after Linda, the person who'd quietly risked her own standing in this community for months on end, photographing documents alone in empty offices, long before anyone else had been brave enough to ask Diane a hard question even twice. Ashley reached out again near the very end of that summer, asking carefully if she could see the lake sometime, not as any act of reclaiming anything, she clarified quickly over the phone, just to finally understand what her father and mother had spent so many years fighting over from such a strange distance. I invited her down one quiet afternoon not long after. She stood at the water's edge for a long time, saying very little at first, before finally admitting she understood now, standing right there, why my grandfather had refused to sell all those years ago. Some things, she said quietly, weren't ever really about money at all. We talked for over an hour that day together, about her father, about grief, about how easily inherited resentment could slowly calcify into something neither of us fully recognized until it finally broke apart completely inside a crowded clubhouse. It wasn't quite friendship exactly, but it was something honest between us both. Diane's criminal case moved steadily toward trial that following autumn, prosecutors feeling confident in the detailed paper trail Priya and Linda had carefully built together. Evidence far stronger than the shaky, forged documents Diane had once waved so confidently across HOA podiums for nearly a decade without any real challenge from anyone. I was formally asked to testify, and I agreed without any real hesitation, though standing in that courtroom felt genuinely strange, revisiting every survey stake, every glossy rendering, every quiet moment of doubt neighbors had once directed toward me instead of the woman who was actually deceiving them the entire time. On the stand, I simply told the plain truth, the way I'd wished I could have from the very first meeting. This was my grandfather's lake, deeded fairly, cared for faithfully, and never, at any single point, available for anyone else's decision to make but my own personal one alone. Diane's attorney tried briefly to suggest I'd simply overreacted to a well-meaning community proposal. But the forged easement document, the fabricated Blue Point filings, and Priya's detailed financial trail made that particular framing collapse almost immediately under even gentle cross-examination from the prosecution shortly afterward that same day. The trial lasted 6 full days altogether. I attended most of them personally, sitting a few quiet rows behind Ashley, who came every single day despite everything happening around her. Her steady presence a quiet, difficult act of honesty I genuinely respected more than I could have easily explained to anyone watching us both. Detective Reyes testified carefully about the shell account traces. Priya walked the jury methodically through 9 years of inflated invoices with patient, careful clarity, and Linda described, in careful detail, the many months she'd spent documenting a system built entirely to survive without ever once being seriously questioned by anyone before. Diane herself took the stand briefly near the end, still trying, even then, to frame her actions as unfinished tribute to Roy, insisting she'd always fully intended to return the funds once the waterfront project eventually succeeded, an explanation that convinced almost no one seated quietly in that courtroom that day. I watched her very carefully during her testimony, searching for some trace of the confident woman who'd once stood at a podium describing my lake as a generous gift she was bestowing on the neighborhood. What remained looked tired and smaller, finally entirely out of scripts left to perform for anyone. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours before finally returning guilty verdicts on the primary counts: embezzlement, fraud, and forgery, though ultimately acquitting on one lesser charge the prosecution had privately considered something of a long shot from the very beginning of the entire case. Diane showed no visible reaction at all as the verdicts were read aloud, staring straight ahead the whole time, as though some part of her had already quietly accepted this outcome long before the jury ever even left the room to deliberate over evidence that had simply become undeniable by that point. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later, giving the entire community, and me personally, time to finally exhale fully for what felt like the very first time since that survey crew had first appeared near my shoreline the previous spring, driving stakes into ground that had never once been theirs to measure. The Cedar Hollow clubhouse felt genuinely different the next time I walked in. No glossy renderings glowing on the projector, no clipboard-carrying figure commanding the podium with borrowed confidence. Just Linda seated at a plain folding table, agenda printed simply, numbers laid bare for anyone willing to actually check them themselves. Linda opened that meeting quite differently than Diane ever once had, inviting genuine questions before presenting anything at all, admitting openly that trust had been badly broken and needed to be rebuilt slowly, one transparent decision at a time, rather than restored through polished slideshows and rehearsed empty reassurance. A resident asked cautiously whether the old waterfront development reserve still existed anywhere in the association's accounts. Linda confirmed it did, though considerably smaller than Diane had once implied, and proposed the board formally dissolve it entirely, returning remaining funds toward long-neglected pool and clubhouse repairs instead of anything else. The vote passed unanimously, quiet and entirely unremarkable, exactly the kind of ordinary, boring governance Cedar Hollow should have practiced all along. Instead of chasing fantasy waterfront parks built carefully on forged documents and one widow's decades-old grudge against a family that had simply wanted to be left quietly alone. I sat through that entire meeting without needing to defend a single thing, without a single folder of deed copies balanced anxiously on my lap, and realized, somewhere near the very end, just how exhausted I'd actually been carrying that heavy weight for months without ever fully admitting it to myself. Afterward, several neighbors lingered around to talk, not about the lake this particular time, but about ordinary everyday things instead. A leaking gutter, an upcoming block party, small normal conversations that felt, after everything we'd all been through, quietly miraculous in how unremarkable they'd finally become again between us all. Carol invited me warmly to her granddaughter's birthday party that coming weekend. No mention at all of pontoons or waterfront passes anymore. Just a simple invitation. Between neighbors who'd weathered something genuinely strange together and come out the other side with, if nothing else, a much clearer sense of who to actually trust. I went, brought a small thoughtful gift, and stood quietly in Carol's backyard watching children chase a sprinkler happily across the grass, thinking how strange it truly was that something as simple as sunlight on water had nearly torn this entire community apart before finally, slowly settling it back together again. Sentencing day arrived eventually on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday, the kind of ordinary weather that felt almost disrespectful given how much had genuinely unraveled over the past long year. I attended with Mr. Holloway at my side, sitting near the back of a courtroom that somehow felt smaller than I remembered it being. Ashley sat closer to the front by herself, alone, her posture straight and steady despite everything happening around her, watching her own mother led in wearing the plain clothes of someone awaiting judgment rather than the crisp blazers that had once commanded entire rooms full of easily persuaded, trusting neighbors. The judge reviewed the case methodically and carefully, referencing the significant financial harm done to the association, the fabricated documents, and the deliberate, sustained targeting of an individual homeowner's legally protected property, calling the scheme a sustained, calculated abuse of positional trust that had gone unchecked for far too long. Diane was sentenced to 4 years in total, with restitution formally ordered covering the full $91,000 traced by Priya's forensic review, along with a permanent formal bar from ever serving on any homeowners association board again anywhere within the state. A detail that felt, to me personally, quietly poetic. She didn't look back toward the gallery even once as she was led away. Not toward Ashley, not toward me, not toward the handful of former board members who'd once trusted her judgment without question through nearly a decade of unchallenged leadership over Cedar Hollow's entire community. I felt, standing outside the courthouse afterward in the gray afternoon light, less triumphant than I honestly expected to, and more simply, deeply relieved. The kind of quiet exhale that comes after finally setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd almost forgotten what walking without it even felt like. Ashley found me there in the parking lot, her eyes red but steady. "Thank you for not making this worse than it needed to be," she said quietly. I told her the honest truth, that none of it had ever really been about punishing her at all. Only about protecting something my grandfather had built. She nodded slowly, understanding fully, and told me she was moving out of state for a while, needing real distance from Cedar Hollow and everything it now sadly represented for her personally. I wished her genuinely well, meant it completely, and watched her walk toward her car alone under that heavy gray sky. Mr. me home mostly in comfortable silence that afternoon, the kind that didn't need any filling at all. When he dropped me off at last, he simply said, "Your grandfather would have liked how you handled all this," echoing, almost word for word, what Mr. Petrov had told me months earlier that same year. I stood on my dock that evening for a long, quiet time, watching the water slowly go dark and still. The very same lake Roy Whitfield had once wanted badly enough to threaten someone over. The same lake Diane had tried to sell twice over without ever owning a single true acre of it. Linda called a few days later with fresh updates from the HOA, mentioning the board had voted to formally rename the community bulletin the Cedar Hollow Transparency Report. A small, slightly clunky gesture that nonetheless felt like genuine, lasting commitment to never repeating what had happened here again. She also mentioned the insurance settlement had finally cleared completely, recovering a meaningful portion of the missing funds, enough to cover the long-needed pool. resurfacing and clubhouse roof repairs that had sat neglected for years while Diane funneled community attention and money elsewhere entirely for her own purposes. I felt, hearing all of that news, a small satisfaction entirely unrelated to my own personal situation. Just the simple relief of watching a broken system slowly repair itself once the right people finally had access to honest numbers instead of confident smiles and glossy, empty renderings that meant absolutely nothing. The conservation easement on my lake finalized fully that autumn. Permanent paperwork filed carefully with the county, protecting the entire shoreline from any future development forever while preserving my complete private use of the water my grandfather had loved so quietly and so completely across his whole long life. I invited Linda and Priya out together for a small quiet celebration the weekend it finally finalized. Just the three of us out on my dock with simple sandwiches and cold lemonade. An unglamorous, fitting ending to a saga that had briefly threatened to swallow an entire community's trust in itself completely. Priya raised her lemonade glass in a mock toast, joking that she'd never once expected an ordinary HOA case to feel this personally satisfying, having handled dozens over her long career that ended quietly in settlements rather than actual courtroom convictions and permanent board bans like this one had. Linda admitted, more seriously than before, that she'd spent months genuinely terrified Diane would somehow talk her way out of everything, the way she always seemed to before, and that watching the jury's guilty verdict finally land felt like watching 9 years of quiet fear dissolve all at once inside her. I told them both, quite honestly, that none of it would have ever unraveled without their real courage. Linda's quiet documentation, Priya's methodical tracing, two brave women willing to look closely at numbers everyone else had simply trusted because trusting them required so much less personal effort from anyone. We sat there together until the sun finally dropped low over the water. Herons waiting calmly near the far bank. The whole peaceful scene almost absurdly serene given everything it had actually taken to protect it fully. My grandfather, I thought quietly, would have truly loved this exact, ordinary, hard-won evening. Cedar Hollow held its annual fall festival a few weeks later. The very first community event since everything had finally come out fully into the open. I attended cautiously at first, genuinely uncertain how the overall atmosphere would feel among neighbors who'd once doubted me so easily just months earlier. Felt, surprisingly, warm and welcoming. People approached me without the old wariness, asking genuine questions about the lake, about conservation, about my grandfather, curiosity gently replacing suspicion now that the full truth had finally settled clearly into everyone's shared understanding of what had actually happened here. Mr. near the cider stand, raising his cup slightly in a small, wordless toast between us. I raised mine back in return, understanding exactly what he meant without either of us needing to say anything else out loud about survey stakes or forged easements or Roy Whitfield's old, buried grudge. Linda, now formally confirmed as permanent HOA president after a clean, fully transparent election that autumn, gave a short heartfelt speech thanking the entire community for its patience through a genuinely difficult year, promising continued transparency without ever once needing to mention Diane's name directly at all. The crowd applauded warmly and genuinely, nothing at all like the excited, misplaced enthusiasm that had once greeted glossy waterfront renderings built entirely on lies. This particular applause felt earned. Quiet gratitude for ordinary honesty finally restored to a community that had nearly lost it entirely to one person's greed. Winter settled slowly over Cedar Hollow eventually, the lake half frozen along its edges some quiet mornings, Herons long gone south for the season. The whole property noticeably quieter than it had been in over a year of surveys and fundraisers and courtroom hearings stacked one right atop another. I received a letter from Diane in early December, forwarded carefully through her attorney, brief and formal in tone, offering something close to an apology, though still carefully worded, still framing much of what happened as misguided devotion to Roy's memory rather than any deliberate personal theft on her part. I read it slowly twice, feeling far less anger than I honestly expected to. Mostly a tired kind of quiet pity for a woman who'd spent over a decade building her entire identity around finishing someone else's unfinished grudge instead of simply living her own separate, honest life fully and freely. I didn't respond to the letter at all. Mr. I wasn't obligated to in any way. And honestly, I didn't feel I owed Diane anything further at all. Not forgiveness. Not closure. Not even simple acknowledgement beyond the courtroom testimony I'd already given honestly and completely months earlier that year. Ashley sent occasional updates from her new city over the following months. Mostly small ordinary things. A new job. A quiet apartment. A therapist she'd started. Seeing regularly to carefully untangle everything her parents had quietly passed down to her without ever once asking if she actually wanted to carry any of it. I appreciated those small updates more than I ever expected to. The strange, unlikely thread connecting two very different women who'd never have spoken at all if her mother hadn't tried to steal my family's lake first. Twisted proof somehow that even ugly situations could sometimes still grow something genuine between people. The HOA's spring newsletter that following year led proudly with pool renovation photos instead of any waterfront renderings. Funded honestly through recovered insurance money and a modest, clearly explained special assessment residents actually understood fully and approved together through an open, unhurried vote at a proper meeting. Linda mailed me a copy of it. A small yellow sticky note attached simply reading, "Look how boring this is now. I love it." Reading that alone on my porch. Understanding completely exactly what she meant by boring, finally feeling like the highest possible compliment anyone could give. I thought often, throughout that following year, about how close this whole community had come to losing something permanent over one woman's inherited resentment. How easily glossy renderings and confident smiles had nearly overridden simple, easily verifiable facts everyone could have checked from the very beginning if they'd only tried. The real lesson, I decided eventually, wasn't really about HOAs or lakes or even fraud specifically at all, but about how quietly unchecked authority could calcify into something entirely unquestionable if nobody ever bothered asking the simple, uncomfortable question of whether the person in charge actually still deserved that trust anymore. Linda had asked that hard question quietly for months, long before anyone else was brave enough to say it aloud in a meeting. Priya had asked it carefully with numbers alone. Ashley had asked it directly of her own mother. The hardest version of that question anyone in this entire story ever had to face personally. I simply refused, from the very start, to accept an answer that didn't match the plain deed sitting quietly in my file cabinet. My grandfather's careful, unremarkable signature from decades earlier. Proof enough. In the end, against every single rendering and forged document Diane had ever managed to produce. Spring returned fully to the lake by March. The water running clear again. Herons back along the far bank once more. My kayak waiting patiently on its rack undisturbed for the first time in over a full year without a single survey stake threatening the grass beside it anymore. I paddled out early one calm morning, the exact way my grandfather always used to, coffee balanced carefully between my knees, watching the mist lift slowly off the surface exactly the way it had every single spring of my childhood, entirely unbothered by everything that had happened around it recently. The lake, I finally realized, had never actually been the true battlefield at all. It had simply been water, patient and quietly indifferent, while people built entire wars of pride and grief and greed across its calm surface. Wars it had never once asked for and would outlast regardless of who ultimately won. I thought about my grandfather often out there on the water, how simply and quietly he'd protected this place his entire life, without renderings or lawsuits of any kind, just quiet, consistent care and one firm, unwavering no to a man who'd wanted it badly enough to hate him for refusing. That single no had rippled forward across 2 full decades. Through a widow's grief, a daughter's painful reckoning, a neighbor's quiet courage, and finally into a courtroom verdict that closed a chapter Roy Whitfield had first opened long before I'd ever even learned to paddle across these same waters myself. Cedar Hollow, meanwhile, kept slowly rebuilding its own version of genuine trust. Meeting by meeting, transparent report by transparent report, proof that communities really could recover from manipulation if enough ordinary people finally decided asking hard questions mattered far more than comfortable, convenient silence ever could. I still live here today. Lake house quiet and peaceful. Kayak steady on the water most mornings. Deed safely filed away. Conservation easement permanently. Recorded at the courthouse. Every single stake that survey crew once drove into my grass long since pulled up and replaced with ordinary, undisturbed grass again. Diane remains incarcerated as of this writing. Her name occasionally mentioned around Cedar Hollow only in passing now, mostly as a quiet cautionary reference whenever a new board member considers cutting corners on transparency, a lasting lesson embedded permanently into this community's institutional memory going forward from here. The HOA today looks almost entirely unrecognizable from what it once was under Diane. Quarterly audits now standard practice. Every large expense requiring multiple signatures. Meeting minutes posted publicly within days rather than buried or quietly edited overnight the way Diane once handled inconvenient questions from residents. Linda still leads the board today. Re-elected twice since that first difficult year. Genuinely popular precisely because she promises nothing glamorous at all. Only steady, honest, occasionally boring governance. Exactly the kind Cedar Hollow desperately needed after nearly losing itself entirely to one woman's carefully disguised decade-long grudge. Priya occasionally sends me articles about other similar HOA fraud cases happening around the country, always adding some dry comment about how surprisingly common this exact pattern actually is. Unchecked authority quietly hollowing out communities that trusted too easily and questioned far too rarely for far too long a time. Ashley visited once more that following summer, staying only a single night, walking the quiet shoreline with me before leaving again. Still healing slowly. Still untangling inherited grief from inherited entitlement. A process I suspect will take her considerably longer than any single courtroom verdict ever really could on its own. My grandfather's lake remains exactly what it always truly was. Mine. Protected. Quiet. Entirely unremarkable to anyone passing casually by who never learned what nearly happened here. Which is, I've slowly come to believe, precisely the peaceful, ordinary ending this beautiful water always deserved to finally have for itself. I still paddle out most mornings even now, coffee in hand, watching the same herons my grandfather once quietly watched himself, grateful this water stayed. exactly where it always belonged, protected not by simple luck but by a solid deed. A good lawyer, and neighbors finally brave enough to look closely at the truth. Cedar Hollow moved on from all of it, wiser and quieter, standing proof that even the most confident, unchecked authority eventually meets facts it simply cannot outtalk forever. My grandfather's no, spoken so firmly decades ago, finally, fully honored, echoing across water that never once stopped being simply, entirely his and mine. The lake sits still this quiet morning, sunlight breaking gently across its calm surface, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will, long after every forged document and glossy rendering has faded away into nothing more than a story neighbors quietly tell each other now. Years later,